I just have something to tell you. I'm sitting down here at Denny's, and there was a little girl that just walked in that looked exactly like that.
The other patrons at Denny's couldn't believe their eyes when they saw the missing young girl. How likely was it that a kid who had been kidnapped several weeks prior was sitting there in the middle of the day? Upon reaching the scene, the police soon discovered that the horrific case, which rocked not just Coeur d'Alene but the entire nation, was far more serious than they had initially thought. Even worse, the offender was beyond anyone's wildest imagination in terms of depravity, and these were merely the first of his many transgressions. May 16, 2005, a normal rainy day in the Pacific Northwest was interrupted by an urgent 911 call from an Idaho resident living in Kootenai County.
Okay, you need to talk to a deputy about the vehicle for what reason?
Yeah, I sure do.
Okay, what's going on with the vehicle?
Well, the vehicle, I can't explain it to you. You just have the guy call me quickly.
When the resident first noticed a white pickup truck parked on his property and didn't recognize it, he called 911. The caller had no idea that this would set off an investigation that would plunge officials into the most unsettling case they had ever come across. The caller went inside the car and noticed a few possessions while the 911 operator took further information. Subsequently, the same man called dispatch again later that day, and this time it was evident that something was terribly wrong. Many of the details in this movie were previously unheard of and were gathered from real police files, along with gruesome images from the crime site. It turned out that the caller rented out a house close by to his own, which he owned, to Brenda Groen, 40, and her boyfriend, Mark McKenzie, 37. Brenda also shared the house with her 3 other children from a previous marriage. Slade, age 13, Dylan, age 9, and Shasta, age 8. The officials hurried through the continuous downpour. They drove down the dirt driveway to the remote Wolf Lodge residence. They paused as they got closer to take a quick look inside the family's car, which was parked not far from the house. Officers observed what appeared to be gunshot holes in the rear glass and caught a glimpse of a hunting weapon resting on the front seat. Bloodstains on and around the front door became apparent as they got closer to the house. Additionally, blood was found by deputies in a rainwater collection that had developed in the grass along the walkway. They banged on the locked front door and demanded that someone open up in an attempt to get the family to respond. However, the only response they got was from dogs barking. They hurried to the back door, which they found to be slightly ajar. One of the obviously terrified canines was taken into custody right away by the authorities, but the other one stayed inside the house, hiding. They will soon learn the reason for the dog's intense terror. An officer found the most horrific find inside the kitchen. The adolescent man's body lay face down on the ground, his hands duct taped behind his back and his head covered. Subsequently, the officer noticed another victim in the space between the living room and kitchen. It was an adult woman who was fully clothed and lying face down on the floor. Heavy quality zip ties were used to cuff her hands behind her back in a fashion akin to what law enforcement uses. Additionally, the woman's feet and ankles had been restrained with duct tape. Sadly, there was one more body in the living room face down. The victim, an adult male, had just shorts and his wrists and ankles were bound together with zip ties. The 3 were confirmed dead by the police. After that, they looked through the rest of the house for further victims, and in the upstairs loft area, they found more guns. And it was established that nobody else was inside the house following a thorough check, but they had no idea that the worst was still to come. Authorities found more concerning information after conducting a more thorough examination. According to one officer, the Wolf Lodge home often underwent welfare checks, and the family that resided there regularly came and went with friends who frequently stayed over as well. Given that it appeared to be standard procedure, authorities reasoned that it was possible the 2 youngest children had been staying somewhere else. Detectives went to the prosecutor's office later that evening to get a search warrant for the abandoned truck and the Wolf Lodge property. A guy named Steve Groen, the father of the 3 children living at the property with their mother and her partner, unexpectedly called the police station while they were there. He was in desperate need of any information on the horrific tragedy. When Steve told the officer who had been sent to speak with him, the case took an unexpected turn. The worried father claimed that on the night of the killings, all 3 of his children ought to have been inside the house. However, since the residence included just one adolescent victim, It implied that the other 2 younger children were absent. After investigation, it was found that the victims were Brenda, 40, Mark, 37, and Slade, 13 years old. Dylan, 9, and Shasta, 8, were not found. Consequently, shortly after midnight on the day following the discovery of the bodies, authorities released an Amber Alert for the 2 kids. Then, investigators went back to the Wolf Lodge residence. I started a desperate hunt for Shasta and Dylan in the surrounding woods with a renewed sense of urgency. They feared the worst, even though they hoped to discover the kids alive. When the rain finally stopped that morning, the bright daylight revealed how gruesome and violent the inner murder scene actually was. A large blood smear on the back door and other blood droplets inside and outside the door were discovered by investigators. They entered the house and discovered a large number of dried blood spots, some of which included grass clippings from the recently cut lawn. The swinging doors to the kitchen had noticeable crimson marks on them, indicating that someone had passed blood through them. Broken glass pieces littered the living room from the broken coffee table with a glass top. Moreover, blood appeared to be all over the place, on the walls as well as the furniture. Authorities discovered a large amount of blood on bedding in a bedroom after following a red trail of smears and stains down the corridor. Ultimately, investigators found a single plastic zip tie on the floor that matched those used on the victims, even though there was no blood in the upstairs loft area. The evidence found within the house undoubtedly painted a horrifying tale, but as investigators looked into the bodies more, the story grew even more horrifying. It was discovered that Slade's mouth was originally covered with duct tape that had either slid or been forced down around his neck. Additionally, the soles of his bare feet were covered in red stains that gave the impression that he had passed through blood at some point during the attack. The young man appeared to have been severely and catastrophically injured by a blunt instrument to his head and other parts of his body. He ultimately died as a result of the brutal beating. Brenda, Slade's mother, found his head at her feet, sadly because of the severe blunt force injuries on her head. Not only were layers of duct tape twisted in her hair and looped around her head to construct a makeshift gag, but law enforcement was unable to even identify her face. They were only able to positively identify her identity because she had multiple identifiable tattoos. Mark did not have any duct tape on his body like the other 2. But he did have multiple head wounds from blunt force trauma that were obviously visible through to the skull. A peculiar pattern of blood droplets on his body led investigators to believe that someone had moved over him while he was on the floor. The most disturbing discovery was that the framing hammer had been used to commit the murders, since each blow left a cross-hatched circle mark on the victim. Authorities treated the case as though Dylan and Shasta had been abducted by a deadly predator while they kept up their search for them. In an effort to find the missing kids, the Kootenai County Sheriff's Office made requests to the FBI and other agencies. The nation held its breath for several weeks as the search for Dylan and Shasta played out in real time on national television. Dylan and Shasta's father, Steve, were so desperate to discover answers that they even called a psychic to help in the hunt. Sadly, those attempts were in vain. Friends, family, and locals also provided a few leads, but none of them turned up anything. Nearly 2 agonizing months after the killings, on July 2nd, authorities finally received the call they had been waiting for. A Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, Denny's employee thought she knew Shasta from missing person flyers and reported her to the police. The caller stated that the young girl was with an unidentified man and gave a description of his looks. Subsequently, there was another call that strengthened the suspicion that this was, in fact, Shasta. This caller felt much more certain that they had perhaps located the missing child and spoke with a tremendous sense of urgency. As soon as the authorities arrived on the scene, Joseph Edward Duncan III, 42, of Fargo, North Dakota, was identified as the guy carrying the young girl. Detectives soon learned that Joseph had a long criminal past as well. Joseph was only 15 years old when he began committing violent crimes, according to the allegations, and for a crime against a 14-year-old boy, he was given a 20-year prison sentence by the time he was 17. In 1994, he was granted parole following his 14-year sentence. Joseph was then accused of committing another offense against 2 youngsters in March of 2005. Once a friend who works in medicine helped him post bail, he seemed to vanish from sight until now. Authorities also discovered that Joseph was associated with multiple automobiles during this period. According to dispatch, Joseph had taken a red Jeep with fictitious Missouri license plates to the eatery.
Is this her?
I can't. I'm not going to say.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
The car was discovered to have been stolen from an Enterprise rent-a-car in St. Paul, Minnesota. News quickly leaked out, revealing that the young child with Joseph was, in fact, Shasta, who had a horrifying tale to share. Shasta allegedly informed authorities about the fatalities at Wolf Lodge and that Joseph was the culprit before she ever left Denny's restaurant. After that, she was sent to a local medical facility to receive care. Steve Groan, her father, was notified by the police and hurried to the hospital to be by his daughter's side. Naturally, officials apprehended Joseph Duncan right away, but a crucial question remained unanswered. Young Dylan, where were you? Soon after, Coeur d'Alene convenience store security footage was discovered by the authorities. Their conclusions were disturbing. It would appear as though Joseph and Shasta were traveling alone. Later that day, Shasta was visited in the hospital by an officer with experience working with children, and she gave her account of the arduous events that had led up to that point. Please be advised that the information below is extremely upsetting and was provided directly from Shasta. You are urged to use caution. Shasta remembered that on the evening of May 16, her mother woke her up suddenly and informed her that there was an intruder in the house. She entered the living room, where her family had been placed in a comatose state, shackled, and threatened with a gun. Joseph Duncan, a man she claimed to have never seen before, was the one she recognized as the intruder. Joseph gave Shasta a simple shush gesture and tapped her on the head before picking her up and carrying her out the back door after a few moments of mute horror. Shasta was placed on the grass outdoors and given a dire warning. If she didn't keep quiet, she would be harmed or killed. She added that shortly after. Dylan was taken outside and placed on the grass next to her. Then Joseph returned inside, and that's when the situation became lethal. Shasta informed the detective that, at some point after Joseph returned inside the house, she heard Mark yelling, "Ooh and ouch." Then, not knowing what had become of her family, she described how she had seen Slade acting quite strangely while strolling around outside. Shasta then remembered that she and Dylan were being placed in a pickup truck and driven to a nearby property, where Joseph unloaded them into the red Jeep that had been stolen. Shasta went on to tell the detective that Joseph took them into Montana's isolated backcountry, where they made several campground stops. When Joseph had to leave the encampment, she said he would bind her and Dylan to trees and give her really painful slaps. Shasta said that she wasn't sure what was in the little pills he would occasionally drop into their drinking water. The young girl also told how Joseph had made her and Dylan write letters to their father while they were being held captive at the campsites. Shasta wrote in one letter that Joseph had been giving them hope for a safe return, saying, "We might see you guys again." Dylan responded in his letter, "We are still alive. We are okay. We know what happened to Mom." Shasta also claimed that Joseph had once left her chained to a tree. Shasta ultimately found out that they had gone to an abandoned cabin in the woods where Joseph had tormented the small child for hours as Dylan was visibly hurt when they returned. Zephyr really played Shasta a video clip of her brother being beaten and strung from the cabin's crossbeam by a wire noose while his wrists were tied behind his back. The recording shows Joseph bringing Dylan down and reviving him while yelling, "The devil is here, boy, the devil himself." The devil likes to watch children suffer and cry. Joseph also promises to transport Dylan to the hospital. Joseph once began to sing the Lord's Prayer in a voice that sounded unnaturally high. "Can this be your will? You put people on earth to do this. How can you do this? How can you let me? God, where are you? Show yourself." He yelled as he was finishing the phrase, "Thy will be done." Sadly, Shasta's subsequent revelation destroyed any chance that Dylan might still be alive. She also told the police about another event in which Joseph fired a shotgun from within a container, killing young Dylan while apparently reaching inside to fetch a beer. Whether the shot was intentional or not is unknown, but Joseph reportedly set the little boy's corpse on fire at the campsite afterward. Shasta was then loaded into the Jeep and he returned to Coeur d'Alene. Joseph decided to stop at Denny's restaurant as they were driving through the town, and that's when the 911 calls about the little girl who looked like Shasta began to come in. Shasta gave the detective a detailed account of what Joseph had told her about the fatal night at Wolf Lodge and how he had murdered her entire family before the session came to an end. She restated that no one in her family knew him and that he was an absolute stranger. However, Shasta uttered one last thing that completely shocked the detective. Just as the investigators were beginning to believe that this nightmare was coming to an end, Shasta startled the detective by telling him that Joseph had allegedly killed other people violently in the past. The interview came to an end without any further information, and the authorities promptly obtained a search warrant for the stolen Jeep that Joseph was operating. They also started getting ready to search the likely Montana crime site. When forensic experts started looking inside the pilfered Jeep, they discovered evidence outside that indicated it had just been driven on roads covered in dust and brush. They then looked inside and saw a number of completely typical items, including a laptop computer, GPS units, camping gear, and tourism brochures. But it didn't take long for them to discover some more ominous objects, like rope, duct tape, and video production equipment inside the car. That wasn't all, though. Along with these items, investigators discovered a handsaw, a plastic zip tie bag identical to the one used in the killings, and a sawed-off shotgun with duct tape wrapped around the handle. After authorities provided the FBI Computer Forensics Unit with the digital media discovered in the Jeep, they were able to refine the search area in Montana. One day after Shasta's rescue, on July 3, investigators discovered a cabin in the Montana backcountry that appeared to be the same as the one from Joseph's recordings. However, even after a thorough search, Dylan's remains could not be located. Meanwhile, the FBI's computer forensics lab kept extracting data from Joseph's film equipment, including gruesome video footage of Dylan's horrific torture taken inside the ancient Montana cabin. The next day, police were considering transporting Shasta to Montana to help with the search, since they were desperate to discover Dylan's remains. Before that could occur, they got a call that completely altered their situation. FBI agents conducting a search in St. Regis, Montana, notified deputies back in Idaho that human remains thought to be Dylan's had been discovered in a hilly region that matched Shasta's earlier description. Joseph asked to meet with a jail chaplain on the day Dylan's remains were discovered, explaining that he wanted to talk about forgiveness because Dylan killed 3 people in a house. 4 days later, Joseph sat down for a much-needed interview with Kootenai County Police about the Wolf Lodge case. It was found by authorities that Joseph began keeping an encrypted online journal in 2004 under the name The Fifth Nail. After several years, the journal was cracked open, exposing Joseph's perverse worldview. A few days prior to the Wolf Lodge attack, he posted something on the blog. One post written on May 11, 2005 reads, "To be more specific, I am scared, alone and confused, and my reaction is to strike out toward the perceived source of my misery, society. My intent is to harm society as much as I can, then die. As for the I Happy Joe D, well, he was just a dream." The bogeyman was alive and happy long before Happy Joe. Even more disturbing, on February 17, 2005, Joseph wrote, "As long as we keep attacking the symptoms of social disease, the so-called offenders, then our problems will keep getting worse. Someday, I hope, society will be forced to wake up and recognize how it propagates its own misery by denying the truth that criminals are victims too." He expanded on these thoughts, writing 11 days later, "Yes, I know a lot about abuse from all 3 sides. The victims, the offenders, and the systems. I'm not saying to let offenders do their thing. I have no problem with taking direct measures to stop people from hurting people, but I think it is more effective to take direct measures to stop people from wanting to hurt people. We should offer free offender counseling and even amnesty for certain types of offenses if the offender agrees to treatment before they are caught. That would be a very practical and effective way to dramatically reduce crime. I doubt it will ever happen, though, because our society loves the excitement that offenders bring into our living rooms through the media, and we would be lost without someone to point our fingers at. It's important to remember that just days after writing this, Joseph was torturing and assaulting Dylan before taking his life. Joseph told detectives that he had simply happened to walk past the Wolf Lodge house and had seen Shasta and Dylan playing in the yard while wearing their swimsuits. That's when he made the decision to stop and look around the house, starting his dastardly scheme to kidnap the kids. He might have been cruising around looking for his target while packing his car with tools to sedate the victims. He had probably dreamed of something similar numerous times, and he saw this as his chance to take action when he noticed the children. They wanted his detailed narrative of what transpired on May 16th. Joseph claimed that between 2 and 3 in the morning, he drove the stolen Jeep into the Wolf Lodge premises, intending to use the broad field to approach the residence. At this juncture, Joseph elaborated extensively on the extra precautions he took to guarantee. He left no trace and claimed to be well-versed in both criminal procedure and crime scene processing. With pride, Joseph described how he had purchased disposable shoes that were significantly larger than his true size in order to impede the investigation. He boasted that he kept his fingerprints off of anything by wearing gloves. Then he went on to tell investigators that he crossed the expansive field that surrounded the Wolf Lodge home while using night vision goggles to assess the property. Joseph claimed that because he knew there were dogs inside the house, he made an additional effort to keep quiet. Even so, he seemed to already know exactly where the kids slept at night, even if he was worried about finding out where the parents' room was. Investigators deduced that he most likely obtained this knowledge by following the 2 kids prior to the assault. Still, as soon as Joseph was certain that no one was awake and that Shasta and Dylan were asleep, he positioned himself right outside their room. Perched on a lawn chair, he looked closely through the window as if he were about to take them from their beds. However, something occurred that changed the course of the night for the worse. Suddenly, one of the 2 dogs in the family came into the bedroom and started sniffing around, as if it sensed something wasn't quite right. The dog then growled, looking up at the window where Joseph was standing motionless. Joseph immediately leaped from the chair and hurried to the property's fence line, thinking to himself, "Shit, he made me." It appeared as though he was holding the dogs responsible for what transpired, as the word made refers to being discovered or discovered. After waiting at the fence for about an hour, according to Joseph, he noticed no movement inside the house and no one coming out to investigate in case the dog had warned anyone. Joseph claimed he was almost ready to scrap the entire plan in search of any excuse to just walk away. But in the end, he decided that if he returned and found the back door unlocked, he would carry out the crime. Joseph told detectives about this time spent waiting outside, saying, "I kept looking for excuses to not do what I was going to do." He would, however, leave the family alone if the door was secured. Joseph claimed that when he returned home by foot, the door was just barely ajar by happenstance. With the shotgun sawed off, he entered the house with the first round being a bird shot in case the dogs needed to be scared off. He claimed that the second round was a slug meant for the man. To his amazement, the dogs appeared oblivious as he opened the back door, but Joseph claimed he nonetheless withdrew to the fence line for around 30 minutes in order to gather his courage. Then, arming himself with zip ties and duct tape from a backpack he'd left in the field, he slipped back up to the back door, this time donning a mask and hat. Brenda was dozing off on the sofa when Joseph allegedly entered the house. Joseph said, "I froze. I didn't expect anyone to be in the living room." He went on to say that he was afraid for a short while as he backed into the kitchen and watched to see if she would move, but nothing happened and the house was silent. Thus, he kept searching for the 2 dogs, and just as he was walking down the corridor, they suddenly lunged toward him from Slottie's bedroom. Though Joseph said he was ready to fire as he swung the shotgun in their direction, the dogs fled as soon as they saw the rifle. Joseph dove under cover, claiming he could see Brenda had woken up from where he was. Joseph noted that even though she seemed to be staring at him, she didn't seem to notice anything was wrong as she turned out the lamp and went back to lying on the couch. She appeared to be staring at him, but Joseph couldn't determine if her eyes were open, so he decided it was time for a drastic intervention. Joseph approached Brenda, and with the shotgun aimed at her, he asked in a low voice, "Where's your husband?" He claimed that Brenda looked up at him, her face bewildered, so he asked the same question again, this time with greater vigor. Joseph insisted that she take him to the man after Brenda said once more that her husband wasn't home. Joseph continued, saying that Brenda bolted up the stairs to where Mark was resting. Brenda awoke Mark by shaking him and yelling, "There's a man here with a gun," as per his instructions. After that, Mark rolled over and made eye contact with Joseph. Joseph informed the cops, but at this point in the interview, the emotionless murderer lost control for no apparent reason. Once he regained his composure, Joseph explained that he restrained the adults by grabbing 2 sets of zip ties he had previously connected in a policeman's manner. But he hadn't reckoned on Mark's bulk and quickly found himself having to use both sets to keep his wrists secure. Additionally, when he struggled with the zip ties at the top of the stairs, he dropped the one that the crime scene investigator discovered later on in the house search. Joseph said that Mark obeyed Brenda's instructions to secure the zip ties around his wrists and ankles and remained face down on the bed. After Mark became incapacitated, Joseph inquired about the whereabouts of the firearms, leading the couple to believe that his only intention was to pilfer them rather than kidnap the kids. Most likely, he stated this to dissuade the adults from attempting a counteroffensive. The majority of people will risk their lives to keep their kids safe from kidnapping, but not to stop a heist. Mark and Brenda were terrified to fight Joseph because he had such a clear advantage with a weapon, and they were unable to flee because they could not abandon their children. Once they were in the living room, Joseph motioned for Mark to lie face down on the floor. Mark down the stairs on his backside. Then he gave Brenda advice on how to get the kids out of bed. Joseph remembered his mother warning him of the danger, and he heard Slade yell, "Why? Why?" Brenda led Shasta and Dylan back to the living area, where Joseph used zip ties and duct tape to bind their wrists after forcing Slade out of his room after the family was safely on the living room floor. Joseph said to the detectives, "I stood for a moment and surveyed my work. I thought it was easy." The events that transpired after Joseph carried Shasta and Dylan outside and laid them on the grass matched exactly with what Shasta had told the investigators. Joseph took the kids outdoors, went back to his rucksack along the fence line, and got a framing hammer before going into the house again. Once inside, he took the duct tape off Slade's ankles and led him out to a location where the other kids couldn't see him. Joseph suddenly swung the hammer fiercely, striking Slade in the back of the skull. The 13-year-old went face down on the ground as soon as Joseph smacked him again, causing him to immediately drop to his knees. Joseph went back inside the house, assuming he was dead, and urged Brenda to stand up. However, because Brenda was shackled at the ankles, Joseph had to assist her in getting up. After she was upright, Brenda was thrown face first back onto the floor by Joseph, who claimed he attempted to use the claw end of the hammer to cut through the duct tape over her ankles so she could walk. Brenda was obviously hurt from the fall, according to Joseph's, so he made the decision to put an end to her suffering. He mentioned his compassionate side for a little while at this point in the interview, adding, "What I did next was an act of compassion." He then admitted to striking Brenda 2 or 3 times in the head with the hammer. He went over to Mark after he was satisfied that she had died, telling him that Mark was still conscious of what was occurring and hitting him 2 or 3 times on top of his head. Just like Shasta had previously informed detectives, Joseph added that Mark let out an agonizing cry before becoming motionless. When Joseph returned outside, he saw that Shasta and Dylan were both propped up, despite their orders to stay in a laying position, and were talking to Slade, who Joseph was startled to see was still alive and wandering about the outside of the home, perhaps trying to escape and get assistance. As he hurried after Slade, demanding that the 2 small children remain motionless, he momentarily believed the adolescent had escaped. Slade was standing in front of the home, stunned in disbelief from his horrific head wounds, when Joseph regrettably caught up to him. Before he eventually fell to the ground, Joseph savagely hit him multiple times with the hammer in the head, neck, and shoulders. Joseph went back inside to see how Brenda and Mark were doing before departing. After he claimed that both were snoring or murmuring, he smacked each victim's head several more times. He explained that he didn't want to see Brenda get struck, so he covered her head with a blanket and swung through it. Since most of the time offenders only cover up victims they know well, this is exceptional. Given that Joseph describes killing Brenda, it's plausible that he finds it more difficult to kill women than men. Joseph also allowed Shasta to survive. He didn't kill Shasta immediately, like he murdered Dylan, but we don't know if that was part of his plan to kill her later. Joseph maintained that he wasn't acting out of wrath, even though he was aware that the police would likely classify his actions as rage kills. Rather, he provided the insane justification that he had been attempting to end his victim's suffering. Still, Joseph claimed he eventually left the house in Mark and Brenda's white pickup vehicle with the two kids. He left the stolen red Jeep at the additional property after making the short drive there. He left the pickup truck there, piled the kids into the Jeep, and drove off. After finding the unidentified truck on his property later that day, the owner made the 911 scene call you heard earlier. Even so, given Joseph's account of what happened, detectives were left perplexed as to how bloodstains ended up in other parts of the house when the majority of the killings took place in a single room. They questioned Joseph, and his answer made them shiver. Joseph told detectives he saw Slade standing up in the front yard once more as he was leaving. He informed them that daylight was breaking and he had decided not to stop. He knew Slade's injuries would take his life soon. Authorities surmised that Slade had been able to re-enter the house and leave blood evidence in several places before finally passing away from his wounds at his mother's feet, because his body was discovered inside the house the day after his mother died. He was also thought to have left the blood droplets on Mark's torso. Before he left, Joseph acknowledged that he had cleaned the hammer in the sink. Authorities were scrambling to find the murder weapon, but he couldn't reveal its whereabouts because his lawyers wouldn't let him. After the interview was over, investigators were happy to obtain a complete confession to the Wolf Lodge killings. But there were still a lot of unresolved questions. One of the main ones was why Mark and Brenda's truck seemed to be covered in gunshot holes. Another unsettling discovery surfaced while Joseph was incarcerated awaiting his federal trial. Multiple unsettling films from his personal social media profile. Still, none could have foreseen the arrival of a whole new series of nightmares. Investigators received a document titled Autobiography of Ed Duncan from Joseph's old landlady, who said it had been abandoned in Fargo. So with strong psychotic overtones hinting at his perverted ambitions, the unsettling paper described his childhood and other key life events seemingly penned during his adolescent detention. A journal spanning 101 pages, written by Joseph in the 1980s while he was incarcerated, provided additional insight into his darker side. He appeared to have created an alter identity during this period in the 1980s, going by the name Jazzy Jet, and posted pictures of himself online for male fans while dressed in drag and lingerie. It was then discovered by detectives that Joseph had been granted parole in 1994, following his 14-year sentence. In 1996, he was arrested for drug offenses and spent many more weeks in prison before being granted parole again in a short period of time. During this period, he reportedly encountered Anthony Martinez, who was 10 years old. Anthony was unexpectedly kidnapped at knife point on April 4, 1997, as he was having fun in Beaumont, California, with his younger brother and friends. Over the next few weeks, a large number of law enforcement agencies joined forces to search for the small child. Tragically, on April 19, a park ranger discovered his body about an hour from his last known position. Anthony had been restrained with duct tape, just like the victims of Wolf Lodge, and his body bore obvious traces of a severe attack. Even though a composite sketch of the alleged murderer was released and a partial fingerprint was recovered from the duct tape, Anthony's case was never pursued. The evidence in Anthony's case was not linked to Joseph by the authorities until after his apprehension for the Wolf Lodge killings. 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of first-degree kidnapping were officially brought against Joseph on July 12. Only a few weeks after Shasta's rescue, on July 19, Joseph admitted to the murder of Anthony. However, he was connected to other gruesome, unsolved murders as well. Additionally, Joseph admitted to killing 2 young girls in the Seattle region in July 1996, claiming to have killed them both by beating. Authorities thought he was referring to Carmen Cubias, age 9, and Samiejo White, age 11, based on the information he provided and the girls' closeness to his home at the time. After exiting a motel parking lot, the 2 vanished, and around 17 months later, their skeleton remains were discovered in Washington on a muddy hill slide. The lawsuit quickly fizzled out with little evidence at the time. The suspicion of the investigators was that Joseph's confession might be similar to that of other serial killers who have taken credit for acts they haven't committed. In any event, on October 16, 2006, Joseph appeared before a judge in court and entered a guilty plea to the murder and kidnapping counts. He was then given 3 consecutive life terms without the prospect of release. At last, on August 27, 2008, a federal grand jury recommended Joseph's execution. Then he was awarded 3 further life terms in November of the following year. On April 5, 2011, Joseph entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to 2 life terms for the murder of 10-year-old Anthony Martinez from Beaumont, California. Joseph's protective vest during his sentencing hearing is a noteworthy detail. When a prisoner needs to be moved outside of the courthouse and there's a chance he could be shot at, this is occasionally done. Joseph was never charged for the murders of Samayejo White and Carmen Cubias, despite his confession. This may have been because there was not enough evidence to support his case. On March 28, 2021, Joseph passed away in prison from a deadly brain tumor, bringing the horror to an end.